September 1939. The world did not end in a single explosion. It began with a sound. A long, hollow wail echoed through the streets. An air raid siren cutting through ordinary life. Shops froze. Conversations stopped. Mothers pulled children closer. Men looked up at the sky, unsure of what they were about to witness. For Martin Keller, an ordinary civilian living in a small European city, that sound marked the end of the life he knew. Just hours earlier, the streets had been normal. Bread lines, bicycles, laughter, routine. War was something discussed on radios. Distant, political, unreal. Then the sirens came. People ran. Some prayed. Some stood frozen, unable to believe what was happening. Martin grabbed his younger sister's hand and ran toward a basement. Shelter as the first. Explosions shook the ground. Windows shattered. Smoke rose like dark clouds announcing a new era. An era ruled by fear. Inside the shelter, bodies pressed together. Children cried. Old men stared at the floor. The walls trembled with every blast above. This was not a battlefield. These were homes. When the bombing stopped, silence followed, heavier than the noise. Martin stepped outside to see his street changed forever. Buildings burned. A neighbor lay motionless. The sky was still, as if nothing had happened. That day, Martin learned the first truth of World War II. No one was truly a civilian anymore. The war had entered kitchens, bedrooms, schools, and hearts. And for millions like Martin, survival, not victory, became the only goal. The world was at war, and ordinary people would pay the highest price. The bombing did not return the next morning. That was the cruel trick of war. It waited. Martin Keller woke to a city that looked familiar and foreign at the same time. Streets were still there, but their faces were broken. Windows were boarded up. Smoke stains climbed the walls like dark memories. The smell of dust and burnt wood lingered in the air, refusing to leave. People moved differently now, quieter, faster, eyes always drifting upward. Daily life continued, but only in fragments. Bread was rationed. Milk disappeared first. Meat became a rumor. Long lines formed before sunrise. Civilians standing shoulder to shoulder in silence, clutching ration cards like lifelines. Arguments were rare. Hunger made everyone equal. Martin stood in those lines with his sister, counting steps forward, praying supplies wouldn't run out before their turn. Some days they returned home with half a loaf and watery soup. Some days with nothing. At night, the radio became the heart of the house. Families gathered around it, listening for news, hoping for reassurance, fearing the next announcement. Victories sounded distant. Losses sounded closer. Sirens returned without warning. When they did, panic ruled again. People ran to shelters, basements, subway tunnels, any place that promised protection. Martin learned to measure time not by clocks, but by explosions, by the pause between impacts, by the silence that followed. Inside shelters, strangers became companions. Fear erased class, age, and belief. Everyone listened. Everyone waited. Children learned to sleep through thunder that wasn't thunder. Mothers learned to smile while hiding terror. Fathers learned to pretend control they no longer had. After each raid, Martin helped clear rubble. He carried bricks, comforted neighbors, searched for the missing. Sometimes they found people alive. Sometimes they didn't. The hardest part wasn't the bombs. It was uncertainty, not knowing when it would happen again, not knowing if tomorrow would exist, not knowing if survival today meant survival tomorrow. One evening, as Martin walked past a shattered school, he realized something terrifying. The war wasn't just destroying buildings. It was reshaping people. Hope became smaller, fear became normal, and survival became the only ambition left. World War II was no longer headlines on a radio. It was now the rhythm of life itself. Night no longer brought rest. It brought fear. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Martin Keller watched his city disappear into darkness. Streetlights went out one by one. Windows were covered with thick cloth, blankets, even painted wood. No glow, no candlelight, no mistakes. This was the blackout. A single visible light could guide bombers. A single mistake could kill a street. Martin's mother moved carefully through their apartment, checking every window, every crack. His sister held her breath as if silence itself could protect them. Outside, the city felt dead, but it wasn't. It was listening. Boots echoed in the distance. Dogs barked, then went silent. Searchlights swept across the sky like giant fingers, probing for enemy aircraft. Martin stood near the window, heart racing, watching beams of white light cut through the clouds. When planes appeared, the sky erupted. Anti-aircraft fire thundering upward. Explosions lighting the darkness for seconds that felt like eternity. Those seconds were terrifying and beautiful. Then the bombs fell. Life between raids. Days were tense. Nights were unbearable. Sleep came in fragments. People slept fully dressed. Shoes beside their beds. Families kept small bags packed. Documents, bread, photographs, in case they had to run. Martin began noticing whispers in bread lines, coded conversations, careful glances. Words like resistance, arrests, informants passed quietly between people. Trust was dangerous now. A neighbor disappeared one morning. Another family's door was sealed by authorities. No explanations, no questions. Fear changed how people spoke, and how they stayed silent. Moral choices. One night, a man Martin barely knew knocked on their door. His face was pale, eyes frantic. He asked for shelter, just for a few hours. Martin's mother hesitated. Helping could mean prison. Refusing could mean death. In that moment, war wasn't about nations or armies. It was about choice. They let him in. He sat on the floor, shaking, whispering thanks. Martin watched him eat like someone who hadn't tasted food in days. When he left before dawn, slipping into the shadows, Martin understood something that would stay with him forever. Courage didn't always carry a weapon. Sometimes it opened a door. The psychological war. Bombs destroyed buildings. Fear destroyed minds. People jumped at sudden noises. Children stopped laughing. Older men stared into nothing. Time lost meaning. Every day felt borrowed. Martin felt himself changing too. He was more alert, harder, older. One night, after another raid, he stood on the roof and looked across the darkened city. Fires burned quietly in the distance. Smoke drifted under the moon. He realized something chilling. The enemy didn't need to destroy every building. They only needed to make people live in constant fear. And it was working. By 1941, hunger had become louder than bombs. Food shortages tightened their grip on the city. Ration cards grew thinner, portions smaller, promises emptier. Bread was no longer fresh. It was dark, heavy, mixed with fillers. Soup was mostly water. Meat had vanished completely. Martin Keller learned to recognize hunger by sound. Stomachs growling in silence. Coughs that never healed. Footsteps that dragged instead of walked. Every morning began with calculation. Do we eat now or save for later? The rise of the black market. Where law failed, shadows stepped in. Street corners whispered offers. Eggs, butter, sugar, at impossible prices. The black market grew faster than hope. People traded wedding rings for potatoes, family heirlooms for bread. Martin watched neighbors change. Honest men learned to lie. Kind women learned to bargain hard. Morality became flexible under hunger. One evening, Martin was offered extra food in exchange for information. Names, routines, rumors. He refused, but the question haunted him. How long before hunger breaks even the strongest principles? Survival versus dignity. At home, his mother cut bread into smaller pieces, pretending she wasn't hungry. His sister's cheeks grew hollow. Martin took less than his share, telling himself he wasn't as hungry. But hunger doesn't listen to pride. One night, Martin stood in line for hours, only to reach the front and hear the words everyone feared. Nothing left. He walked home through dark streets, empty-handed, carrying failure like a weight. That night, he made a choice. A line crossed. Martin joined others scavenging abandoned buildings. Not stealing, recovering, he told himself. He found old canned goods hidden behind a wall, forgotten by a family who never returned. As he carried them home, guilt mixed with relief. War didn't ask permission to change people. It forced change. The Cost of Hunger. By winter, sickness spread. Weakened bodies couldn't fight infection. Funerals became quiet. Frequent events. No ceremonies. No speeches. Just shallow graves and numb faces. Martin stood beside one such grave and understood something brutal. Bombs killed quickly. Hunger killed slowly and without noise. End of chapter thought. That night, as Martin shared soup with his family, he realized survival wasn't heroic anymore. It was necessary. And World War II was teaching civilians a painful lesson. Sometimes staying alive meant carrying guilt and learning to live with it. By 1942, the war no longer knocked. It crashed through the roof. The sirens began earlier than usual that day. Longer, louder, panicked. Martin Keller felt it in his chest before he heard the first explosion. The ground trembled, not like thunder, but like something enormous waking beneath the city. This raid was different. There was no rhythm, no pause to breathe. Bombs fell in waves, one after another, turning streets into fire corridors and buildings into collapsing traps. Martin ran with his family toward the nearest shelter. Smoke burned his eyes. The air tasted of metal and ash. People screamed names, children, parents, anyone, hoping sound could pull the lost back from chaos. They barely reached the shelter when the blast came. The door slammed shut behind them as the city above began to die. Underground hell. Inside, the shelter shook violently. Dust rained from the ceiling. Lights flickered, then died. Darkness swallowed everything. Some prayed aloud. Some sobbed. Some sat in silence, already broken. A woman nearby clutched a small shoe in her hands, rocking back and forth. A child somewhere screamed until the scream became coughing. Martin wrapped his arms around his sister as the sound above grew, unbearable. Explosions so close they felt personal. Each one felt like it might be the last. Minutes blurred into hours. When the bombing finally stopped, no one moved at first. Silence returned slowly, cautiously, like it was afraid to be noticed. The aftermath. When they emerged, the city was unrecognizable. Entire blocks were gone. Fires burned uncontrolled, painting the sky orange and black. The streets were buried under rubble, glass, and twisted metal. A church tower leaned at an impossible angle. Homes had become open wounds. Martin searched for familiar landmarks. His school, the bakery, the corner where children once played. Gone. Then he saw it. His neighbor's building collapsed completely. He ran, dug with bare hands, ignored the pain as sharp debris tore his skin. Others joined him. They pulled out survivors, then bodies, then nothing. Someone whispered a name Martin knew. It felt like the war had reached into his chest and crushed something vital. Loss. That night, they learned the truth. A close family friend, someone who had shared meals, laughter, and shelter, was gone. No goodbye, no warning, just absence. Martin's mother sat silently, staring at a wall that no longer existed. His sister didn't cry. She just held on to his sleeve, afraid to let go. Grief in wartime had no ceremony, no time. The dead were counted. The living moved on, because they had to. The breaking point. In the days that followed, Martin felt something inside him change permanently. Anger surfaced, hot, directionless, not just at the enemy, but at the war itself, at the skies, at the idea that survival felt random and unfair. He stopped believing safety existed. Every sound startled him. Every night felt borrowed. Every morning felt like defiance. One evening, standing among ruins still smoking, Martin realized the war had crossed from outside to inside him. He was no longer just surviving it. He was carrying it. End of chapter thought. World War II didn't just destroy cities. It shattered timelines. The before, the during, and the after. And for Martin Keller, there would never again be a true before. Only survival and memory. The order came quietly. No sirens, no explosions, just a notice pinned to a shattered wall. Evacuation recommended. Martin Keller stared at the paper for a long time. Around him, people read it again and again, as if repetition might change its meaning. The city that had already lost its buildings was now losing its people. Leaving did not feel like safety. It felt like surrender. Packing a life into a bag. At home, decisions were brutal. What do you take when you don't know if you'll return? Documents, photographs, a coat too thin for winter, bread wrapped carefully like treasure. Everything else, furniture, memories, familiar corners, was abandoned to fate. Martin watched his mother close the door behind them. She didn't lock it. There was no point. The city belonged to war now. The march. The roads were alive with movement. Carts pulled by exhausted men. Children carried by older siblings. Elderly leaning on sticks, refusing to be left behind. No one spoke much. Words were heavy. The only sounds were footsteps, crying infants, and the distant thunder of artillery reminding everyone why they were walking. Martin carried what he could. His sister stumbled often. He lifted her without complaint. No one complained anymore. The line stretched for miles, an entire population on foot, moving away from a place that had once been home. The first separation. It happened at a checkpoint. Soldiers stopped the line, checking papers, redirecting people. Confusion spread quickly. Orders changed. Shouts echoed. In the chaos, a mother screamed for her son. A husband was sent one way, his wife another. Children clung to strangers. Martin felt his sister's hand slip. For one terrifying second, she was gone. He pushed through the crowd, heart pounding, shouting her name. When he found her crying near a cart, relief hit him so hard his knees weakened. Others were not so lucky. That day, Martin learned another truth of war. Bombs destroy families quickly. Evacuation destroys them slowly. Life as a refugee. They reached a temporary camp days later. Fields filled with tents. Barns overcrowded with strangers. Thin soup served once a day. Privacy disappeared. Dignity followed. People who once owned homes now begged for blankets. Teachers, shopkeepers, craftsmen stood in line like everyone else. At night, Martin listened to whispers of rumors. Cities erased. Front lines collapsing. Places safer than others. No one knew what was true. The future felt like fog. The psychological weight. Martin struggled to sleep. Every noise reminded him of bombs. Every dream ended with running. His mother aged visibly. His sister stopped asking when they would go home, because everyone knew the answer. Home might not exist anymore. A quiet moment. One evening, Martin stood at the edge of the camp, watching the sun set over unfamiliar land. The sky was peaceful, mockingly so. He realized something deeply painful. Occupation did not arrive with an explosion. It arrived with rules. Martin Keller first noticed it in the silence. Streets were repaired just enough to function, but not enough to feel alive. Signs changed language. Curfews were announced. Armed patrols appeared at corners where children once played. The war had shifted shape. It was no longer chaos. It was control. Checkpoints and papers. Every movement required permission. Papers were checked. Names questioned. Faces studied too long. A pause at a checkpoint could stretch into terror. A wrong answer could end a life. Martin stood in line one morning. Documents clenched tightly. A soldier inspected his papers, eyes cold, unreadable. For a long moment, time stopped. Then the papers were handed back. Move. Martin moved, heart pounding, legs weak, knowing others weren't always so lucky. Life under watch. People learned new habits. Voices lowered indoors. Windows stayed covered even during daylight. Neighbors stopped asking questions. Trust became dangerous. Someone was always watching. Someone was always listening. A man down the road was arrested for owning a radio. Another disappeared after a late-night knock. No explanations followed. Fear became organized. The quiet resistance. Resistance did not always mean weapons. Sometimes it meant hiding food. Sometimes it meant passing messages. Sometimes it meant saying nothing. Martin helped where he could, carrying notes folded into bread wrappers, guiding strangers through alleys after curfew, warning others when patrols approached. Each act was small. Each act carried death as a possible consequence. Yet people did it anyway, because occupation tried to take more than freedom. It tried to take identity. A moment of defiance. One evening, Martin witnessed something that stayed with him forever. A soldier shoved an old man for moving too slowly. The crowd froze. No one dared react. Then a woman stepped forward. She said nothing. She simply stood beside the old man. Others followed, one by one. Silent. Still. The soldier hesitated, then turned away. No cheers followed. Just breathing. Martin understood then. Resistance wasn't loud. It was presence. The constant tension. Every day balanced on a knife's edge. Martin's mother feared every knock. His sister learned to stay invisible. Sleep came lightly, interrupted by footsteps and shouts outside. The war pressed down without firing a single shot. End of chapter thought. Occupation taught civilians a cruel lesson. You could survive bombing by hiding. You could survive hunger by adapting. But to survive occupation, you had to protect something invisible, your will. And as Martin Keller walked home past armed patrols and silent faces, he knew the war wasn't over. It had simply learned how to whisper. By 1943, fear had taken a new form. It no longer came from bombs or hunger. It came from people. Neighbors whispered in corridors. Friends glanced suspiciously. Smiles were weighed with caution. In the war, betrayal became currency. Sometimes sold for safety, sometimes for greed, sometimes for survival. Martin Keller felt it first on a cold morning when an acquaintance mentioned he had seen a stranger near their home. He didn't know whether to be relieved or terrified. Underground networks. The war created shadows within shadows. Resistance groups moved quietly through streets, delivering messages, smuggling food, helping those hunted by the occupying forces. Martin was asked to help. a small task. Guide a young courier through the city's ruined sections, past checkpoints, past patrols, past eyes that watched without blinking. He hesitated. Every step carried life or death. Every choice weighed like stone. He took a deep breath and agreed. The first night was terrifying. They moved silently through back alleys, crouched beneath shattered walls, listening to the patrol's footsteps above. Every shadow could be a threat, every echo a warning. When they finally reached a safe house, Martin realized resistance was not heroism. It was calculated courage. A friend turned enemy. Weeks later, tragedy struck closer to home. A neighbor, someone Martin had trusted for years, reported a small act of resistance, a misplaced ration hidden for someone else. That neighbor received protection. The others faced punishment. Trust fractured. The community cracked. Martin felt the weight of moral compromise. He understood then. In war, the wrong choice could cost more than a life. It could cost your humanity. The risk of everyday life, even daily life, carried danger. A smile in the wrong place, a comment taken out of context, a glance mistaken for suspicion. Martin and his family moved through the city like ghosts. Food had to be obtained quietly. Movement was carefully timed. Every day, survival required not being noticed. And every day, the stakes grew higher. The life-changing decision. One night, Martin received a desperate knock. A young child, alone, terrified, with a note clutched in her hand. Parents arrested, nowhere to go. Martin could take her in, risking his family. Send her away, saving them but condemning her. His heart pounded. His mind raced. He remembered the first night of bombing. The evacuation, the frost, the hunger, the fear. He could not let history repeat itself in silence. He took the child in. That night, he felt something fragile awaken inside him. Hope. Not the naive hope of peace, but the stubborn hope of humanity, surviving amid destruction. By 1944, the war had changed. The front lines shifted, and hope flickered through destruction like a fragile candle. Martin Keller had grown older, not just in years, but in the ways of survival. Every scar, every sleepless night, every rationed meal had taught him something essential. Life continued in the smallest acts of courage. The news came first in whispers. Allies were advancing. The enemy was retreating. Some soldiers returned exhausted, wounded, eyes hollow yet determined. Civilians began to murmur about liberation. But hope, in wartime, is always mixed with fear. Streets between hope and despair. Martin walked through streets half destroyed, half alive. Children played in rubble, as if laughter could erase smoke. Women cooked over open fires, murmuring prayers between bites of meager soup. Men cleared debris, repaired roofs, or simply stared into nothing. Every day was an act of balancing despair with resilience. He had learned to read the sky for danger and opportunity alike. Every plane overhead could signal liberation or destruction. Every distant gunshot could save or kill a family. Martin's city, once a vibrant place of markets and festivals, was now a strange world. 1 foot in destruction, 1 foot in renewal. The risks of hope. The Allies' arrival brought more than promise. It brought violence in different forms. Soldiers moving through towns were unsure of civilians. Some civilians clashed with retreating forces. Rumors spread. Collaborators punished. Spies discovered. And revenge enacted. Martin's family had to navigate this new battlefield carefully. Every action, helping the wounded, sharing food, guiding a lost soldier, carried risk. Even hope demanded strategy. Civilian uprising. In some sectors, civilians began to act. Groups of men and women, emboldened by the retreat of enemy troops, organized quietly. They repaired bridges, cleared streets, and guided refugees. Others took vengeance, harshly punishing collaborators or former oppressors. Martin observed all of it, heart heavy with conflicting emotions. Could survival coexist with justice? Could anger coexist with humanity? He did what he had learned. Small acts mattered. He helped rebuild homes, cared for the sick, comforted children. He saved lives quietly, without ceremony, because that was all he could do. Loss amid hope. Even as the war turned, Martin endured loss. The child he had sheltered, the symbol of hope, fell ill. Resources were scarce, doctors overworked, medicine almost non-existent. He watched helplessly as her small body weakened, clinging to life with desperate determination. Not all endings in war are triumphant. Some are quiet, painful, and leave marks that last decades. The lesson of survival. By the end of 1944, Martin understood. Victory does not erase trauma. Liberation does not undo grief. Civilians survive by adapting, by protecting each other, and by holding on to fragile hope. May 1945. The war had ended, not with fanfare, not with celebration for all. It ended with silence. The streets Martin Keller once knew were still scarred, buildings standing as hollowed skeletons of memory. Smoke lingered faintly. Windows gaped like eyes watching the past. Rubble crunched beneath every cautious step. Yet, amidst the ruins, the first signs of life emerged. Returning to normal, Martin walked through the city slowly, carrying his small bag and the child who had survived the illness. Families emerged from basements, shelters, and abandoned homes. Some hugged, others wept. Some simply stared, unable to believe the world had not ended. For Martin, the streets were familiar and alien all at once. The bakery was gone. The school roof had collapsed. The old fountain in the town square had been reduced to a broken statue. Yet the air smelled different, faintly of hope, dust, and the promise of rebuilding. Rebuilding lives. Food remained scarce. Homes required repairs. Work was uncertain. But slowly, people began to reclaim their lives. Children ran through alleys cleared of rubble. Neighbors shared bread and stories. Women opened temporary stalls, selling small meals. Men rebuilt fences, walls, and roads, piece by piece. Martin joined in, carrying bricks, salvaging wood, helping wherever possible. Every small act of repair felt like resistance to the destruction he had endured. The cost of war. Even as the city stirred to life, Martin knew the war's cost could not be measured in rubble or money. Friends were gone, families broken, memories haunted every step. He looked at his sister and the child he had protected, realizing that survival was not just about avoiding bombs. It was about enduring the loss, trauma, and moral compromises that the war forced upon ordinary people. Martin often sat quietly in the evenings, staring at the horizon. He wrote letters to missing friends, prayed for those who had died, and reflected on what humanity had endured. The war had left scars, visible and invisible, but the human spirit, though bruised, remained unbroken. A quiet victory. Freedom did not erase pain. It did not erase the nightmares, the hunger, the fear, or the betrayals, but it gave people something they had longed for: agency. Martin understood that survival was no longer enough. Life demanded rebuilding, connection, and courage to face a future without certainty. He walked through the city, past ruined streets, past silent churches and broken fountains, feeling the weight of every lost year. Yet, for the first time in 6 long years, he breathed freely. The lesson of a generation. World War II had ended, but it had taught a generation. Courage is often quiet, small, and uncelebrated. Survival is a triumph, even without fanfare. Humanity persists, even in the darkest times. Memories must guide rebuilding, lest history repeat itself.